said, I'd like to get started. My name, as I said earlier, is Jeremy Baluma, and I am the National Project Manager at the Bureau of Land Management, and I'm the primary point of contact for this Energy Corridor Regional Review effort. I'd like to welcome you and thank you for your interest in participating in this process. This is meant to be a comprehensive effort between Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, Department of Energy, and in cooperation with National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, Bureau of Reclamation, Department of Defense, and the assistance of Argonne National Laboratory. We've all been working together to review the energy corridors on public land and national forest land across the 11 western states. The purpose of the review is to periodically assess the need for corridor revisions, deletions, or additions. That assessment occurs within a framework of corridor siting principles agreed to by the agencies in a 2012 settlement agreement. One of our major emphases in this effort is to make this a very collaborative effort among interested stakeholders, including states and tribal governments, the energy industry, NGOs, public land users, interest groups, and local governments. We hope this will enable the agencies to develop a comprehensive review and analysis as we look to the future energy corridors across these western states. I'd like to note that Reggie Woodruff is the national lead for the U.S. Forest Service on this effort, and that the best way to reach out to questions to both of us is to email at corridors at anl.gov. I'll mention that website again, and you'll get that that email address link in a thank you for participating email following this webinar. Reggie, would you like to say a couple of introductory words?
Yes, Jeremy, thank you. I am Reggie Woodruff. I am, as Jeremy stated, the Forest Service lead for 368 corridor reviews. I serve on the working group with BLM and Department of Energy counterparts to ensure the corridor reviews meet their intent and that we are actively engaging Forest Service leaders and stakeholders. Forest Service designated about 1,000 miles of corridors in 10 states and amended 38 national forest land management plans during the corridor designation. And currently, Forest Service lands in our regions 2, 3, and 4 are being evaluated or studied in the current reviews. There, in those regions, our special uses managers and forest planners are reviewing abstracts and providing feedback to ensure the corridors provide the most environmentally feasible areas for energy siting on National Forest System land. Jeremy gave you contact email, and please, if you have any questions about corridor reviews on National Forest System land, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. Our goal today is to help orient you with the process and the tools available to review and to provide your input for the Westlight Energy Corridor reviews in the areas that we've designated regions 2 and 3 for this corridor review. And we're also fortunate to have John Kalish with the Bureau of Land Management's Washington office join us today, and he'd like to say some introductory remarks as well. John?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I am the Chief of Renewable Energy and Rights of Way back here in the Washington office. And on behalf of the BLM, I want to thank all of you for attending this webinar on the 368 Energy Corridor Regions 2 and 3 studies. These upcoming studies are very important to us in terms of maintaining a very viable transmission corridor network in the western U.S. in meeting requirements of the 2005 Energy Policy Act involving energy corridor designations, and in meeting initiatives including promoting energy independence and increasing infrastructure investments under existing presidential executive orders. In this webinar, you will see our interactive corridor mapping tool that is an easy way to understand the complexities of energy corridor management. Effective corridor designations today will greatly facilitate meeting energy demands in the future. Getting these regional studies right is important, and that's where you come in. We look forward to your involvement and a thorough review of energy corridors within these two regions. And with that, I thank all of you again for coming on to the webinar, and I'll send this back to Jeremy.
Thank you very much, John. So I'd like to start with reference the main web page that we're looking at here on your screen. And this web page is really a repository for all of the regional reviews and has lots of information and links. You can actively participate throughout this process with information being readily available. Before we get started with our Regions 2 and 3 process, I'd just like to mention some of you are familiar with our Region 1 review process and are maybe wondering about the status of that. I just wanted to inform those of you who are still waiting on that our target release date for the draft report for Region 1 is sometime in March of this year. I apologize for the delay with that and look forward to getting that out to those of you who are waiting. With that, I'd like to ask Jim, who's navigating our webinar today, to take us to the regional tab on this page. What I'd like to focus here for just a second on is our process and give you a little bit of an overview of how that has come together. I'd like to call your attention to sort of the 4 bullet points in the 3rd paragraph. You know, a big component of this regional review process revolves around the 4 siting principles that I mentioned earlier. The first one of which I'll read is, corridors are thoughtfully sited to provide maximum utility and minimum impact to the environment. The rest you can read for yourself. I don't want to get too far into the details, but want to let you know that that is a big emphasis with the framework that we are looking at the corridors under review. Jim, if you could take us to the Regions 2 and 3 page. Here you'll see that this is more a close map of the area that we are currently reviewing. Region 2 and 3 includes all of New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and portions of Arizona and Nevada. The labels you see on this map are the actual corridor numbers. So those would become key as we begin to look through these. In order to sort of organize and accomplish this review, we needed to build a process. And so I'd like to have Jim also click on our graphic on this Region 2 and 3 webpage. If you scroll down, now this graphic is really sort of a roadmap for this process of regional reviews. You can see on the top, steps 1, 2, and 3 are sort of our overall steps in this process. Really the base process and foundation to these reviews is developing these corridor abstracts. That would be step 1. Step 2 is going to be workshops. We plan to have those in late May or June sometime this year. And step 3 is really the final roll-up of the report, being the draft report, then into the final report. And before we go into the details in the middle, I want to take note to the red lettering on the bottom where stakeholder input is really important in this process. And we've allocated the 45 day comment window right now during this process of the abstract development. And then following the finalization of these abstracts, we're going to have some in-person stakeholder workshops where recommendations can be also put into place. And then once we have all that and roll that up into sort of a draft report, we're going to be asking for stakeholder review of that draft report before it is finalized. And really what I want to emphasize too is that this entire process is to get as comprehensive of information as possible about really the best siting for energy corridors in the futures, and to make them as compatible as possible with all that information to be considered into the future land use planning process by both Bureau of Land Management as well as the National Forest Service. So with that, I'd like to just quickly, briefly explain the initial inputs. So if you look under step 1, the blues, we have initial inputs, we have analysis framework, and then we have analysis. So stepping back for just a second, to accomplish the periodic review and analysis, we needed additional information and also a framework through which to accomplish the review. And that's what we're looking at here. The initial inputs is sort of a compilation of information that was previously there. We already knew where the corridors were designated, but we wanted to go back to the original study. But we also wanted to augment that information, and we sent out requests for information and have compiled that into our analysis framework. Our analysis framework is the framing and the siting of the corridors so that we could look at them in depth through several lenses, one of which being the 4 siting principles, others being resource conflict maps, and land use plan prescriptions. So further, that brings us into the analysis portion. That's where we're at today. Up to this point, we've really bracketed and stratified these initial inputs across this analysis framework and categorized the analysis outputs into 3 categories or buckets. The first is confirming that, if it met the best siting principles, we confirmed that the existing corridor best meets those siting principles. And you'll see this further as we get into the abstracts later. The second bucket would be identifying an opportunity or opportunities to improve the corridor placement, or to improve, to implement an IOP, which is an interagency operating procedure. You can think of those as a best management practice related to utilization of a corridor. The third bucket is acknowledging a concern or concerns that aren't easily resolved or avoided at corridor level planning. Some things are just outside of the scope of this review. So with that said, I wanted to remind you that all of this gets rolled up into a final report. Our dates and timeframes for this regions 2 and 3 is to have the abstracts finalized sometime in April of this year, workshops in May to June, a draft report out by September or mid-September, and then a final report of December of this calendar year. And then again, all that gets carried into future land use planning efforts, which additional stakeholder input will be taken into account. With that, I'd like to transition over to Argonne National Laboratory, who's been working on this effort, and Jim Kuiper will help show us how to go through sort of some of the tools that are available as you go through reviewing the preliminary abstracts. Jim?
Thank you, Jeremy. First of all, I'm going to take a look a little farther down the page and point out the abstracts are released right here at the bottom of that page. So if you're on the main website, you can download each abstract for each corridor for regions 1 and 2 from the main website on this page. And then if we go back to the home page, this link right at the top right launches corridor mapping tool, and it's also on the maps and data page. So when I click that, and by the way, I need to have pop-ups enabled both for this to work and for elements of the mapping tool to work. it opens up a new tab in my browser. So the first thing that appears is a splash screen. Gives me an option to register. So I've registered already, but I just want to show you that. And there's a short form that you fill out, and it includes an email, a password of your choice, and just a couple pieces of information that help us understand who's using the tool. And you click register. When you do that, it will send an email. It'll confirm your registration through an email, and that email will contain a link for you to verify your email address. So there's really two steps that are necessary to register, and you need to click that link. If you don't receive that email, maybe it went to your junk folder or something else went wrong, there is a possibility if you have a typo in your email address that we won't be able to contact you or you won't get the message. So anticipate that message. If you don't get it, you can also contact the email address that Jeremy gave, corridors@anl.gov, and let us know, and we'll try to help you with that. Once we receive your email confirmation, we also need to grant you access, and that might take a short period of time. We try to get to those as quickly as possible, especially during business hours. And you'll get a final email inviting you to log in with the credentials that you provided. I've already got my username and password cached here, so I'm just going to click log in. And what that does is just refresh the view, and very importantly, it adds another layer to the map, which is the transmission line layer. And that's one of the layers that's been licensed for use on this website. And in the terms and conditions is a short paragraph asking you to make sure that you use it only for the intended purposes. So that's part of the reason for registration. This panel at the top left shows a whole slew of different categories. There are actually 121 layers in this tool that you can add to the map. There's a few down here that have been added by default, but the others are accessible in this panel. So, for example, under Energy, we have a section for Section 368 Energy Corridors. The ones with check marks are the ones that are already on the map. And I can click any of these, toggle them on and off on the map by clicking that box. All right, most of our work will be concerning regions 2 and 3, and I'm just going to zoom into that area using the zoom box tool. And you can see a little bit greater amount of detail at this stage. Next, I'm going to bring up an abstract for a particular corridor, and today we'll be talking about this corridor here, 66212, in the center of region 3. And to get the abstract, these are the same abstracts that were on the web page. You can use the View Abstract tool and then click one of the corridors on the map. What that does is open the PDF in a new tab. Again, you need to have your pop-ups enabled for that function to work. And at this point, I'm going to invite Ellen to start working with me to present the content of the abstract, and we'll bounce back and forth to the mapper at some points to help you show how these tools complement each other.
Okay, thanks, Jen. This is Ellen White again. I'm going to briefly go over the abstract for corridor 66212, including the contents of the abstract as well as the type of input that we're looking for. So the first section is the introduction, and it just describes the overall location of the corridor and its designated use, the corridor length, jurisdictions within the corridor, as well as any other relevant information about the corridor. For example, corridor 66212, the introduction explains that portions of the corridor in the BLM, Fillmore, and Salt Lake field offices are not designated due to the National Defense Authorization Act. And there's another portion of the corridor that was removed in the Utah Greater Sage-Grouse RNP Amendment. And that, it shows up in that little figure below. But Jim is going to take us to the mapping tool to show us what that looks like in Mapper, those two
All right, so switching back to the mapping tool, I'm going to just cancel this tool that I have used, and then use ZoomBox. And the area that we're interested in is right here. I'm familiar with where it is. But if you're not familiar, you can zoom in on a portion of the corridor and begin using these mileposts as a basis for orienting yourself. So we'll be talking about mileposts quite a bit, and those are these sequential numbers. They're just like a road mileposting system, and it's only used as a reference for describing locations along the corridor. It does span areas where the corridor isn't designated, and there's no implied location or designation there. It's just simply a way of referencing a location, including in the corridor gaps. So the gray area here, if we pan down to the legend in the table of contents, you can see green is designated corridor. The orange shows portions of the corridor that were modified or undesignated in a resource management plan. And then the gray area actually had been part of the EIS planning, but it wasn't ultimately designated in the resource management plan due to the National Defense Authorization Act prohibiting it in that area. All right, let's go back to the abstract.
Okay, so after the introduction, we have a few maps, overview maps, but again, go to the mapping tool if you want specific information about locations within the corridor. The next section is the corridor rationale, and that describes the rationale for why the corridor was designated, including whether or not the corridor was locally designated prior to Section 368 designation, as well as any existing infrastructure within the corridor and any potential for new development. The example for corridor 66212, this section explains that the corridor was locally designated and that there is existing infrastructure within the corridor. And so for this section, we are asking for input on potential future development or other additional information about the area, such as changing energy demand. The next section is corridor of concern status, and this describes whether or not the corridor was identified as a corridor of concern in the settlement agreement. So for corridor 66212, this was identified as a corridor of concern for a number of reasons, including access to coal, impacts on National Register of Historic Places, America's byways, Old Spanish National Historic Trails, BLM Wilderness Study Area, Utah Proposed Wilderness, Critical Habitat, and Arches National Park. And so these issues are highlighted in yellow in the corridor analysis table below, which we will go over in a little bit. But first, I would like to have Jim demonstrate how you can view the corridors of concern on the mapping tool.
All right, back to the mapping tool. We're still zoomed into this area, and if I open up the energy group, I can, there's the corridor of concern layer that is not turned on by default, so I'm going to add that to the map. And it's a little hard to see, but what it does is add yellow highlighting to the corridors that had concerns expressed in the settlement agreement. So not all corridors are corridors of concern. Only the ones with highlighting would be that have concerns stated in the settlement agreement. And I can also use the info tool and click on one of the areas that's highlighted. This tool brings up information about all the features that are at the click point. So at this time, I have corridor concern on the map, and so it's showing me that. And the text, you can expand this a little bit and see the full text, but the concern that's stated in the settlement agreement are given here, and it's the same information that's in the abstract. And you can get information from other features are listed in the info box.
Okay, the next section is conflict map analysis, and these conflict maps were uniquely developed for the regional reviews process, and it's a resource conflict assessment to help identify a corridor's proximity to environmentally sensitive areas using criteria from the conflict assessment criteria table, which is available through the hyperlink on the abstract, that blue highlighted criteria, and you can click on that. And that will pop up the criteria table. So these criteria, the low, medium, or high, were applied to each corridor to generate conflict maps to help review whether the corridor's current location best meets the settlement agreement siting principles to provide maximum utility and minimum impact to the environment. So Jim, you can click off of that and go back to the abstract and show what the map looks like on the abstract. So it depicts where the corridor crosses low, medium, or high potential conflict areas and can be seen or can be used to see whether or not there appears an opportunity to shift the corridor to align with the lower conflict area. Existing infrastructure is considered low potential conflict, although that doesn't show up in the conflict maps on the abstract. But the conflict layer is available on the mapping tool, and Jim's going to demonstrate that right now.
All right, so I'll show you two ways to find it. One is to open up this section right below the Section 368 corridor, and we have this regional review assessment. And the tooltip text that comes up gives the full name. So potential conflict is in the title. Shortcut, once you're a little bit more familiar with the content of this site, is to just type in the search box. So if I type conflict, then it'll highlight the layers that have that phrase or sequence of characters in their title, and you can use that and check that box directly from the search section. Then you can clear the text to close that. So another thing that I'm going to just show quickly is a way to highlight one layer versus another. So this layer came at the top and it's transparent and it's blending with the colors of the Surface Management Agency layer. So here I can turn the transparency to 0 for Surface Management Agency, and that allows me to see those colors more distinctly from the conflict map. And I won't demonstrate it at the moment, but if you click the info tool on the conflict map, a large dialog of all the layers contributing to it shows, and you'll be able to tell what contributed to that particular location in the conflict map.
This is Jeremy. I would like to also point out that we've tried to incorporate everything into this geospatial mapping tool, and what Jim and Ellen are describing as they talk about the conflict criteria and then the mapping that sort of consolidates that and reflects whether that's in a low, medium, or high potential area for conflict. That's really representative here, and it's really a way, and it's very important to understand that this is a general, sort of a broad stroke way, but it's taken into the finer scale details of the potential resource conflicts related to the corridor siting. And I just want to again emphasize that this is based on a framework of the 4 siting principles that we talked about before. As you can kind of see here, this area looks mostly orange. You see a little yellow up there. Jim, if we went back to the abstract, I would just that this overall, this corridor 66-212 kind of starts at outpost 0 in the upper left, and then kind of follows down through mostly orange, then into some yellow past Wellington, more orange, so medium conflict, towards Green River. And then if you could scroll to the next page, you know, it certainly goes through more areas beyond Green River towards Moab and gets into some red areas, which is a potentially a high conflict area because of the resource values there in that area. But what you can't see quite in this abstract little snapshot of the conflict layers is what you will be able to see in finer detail within the mapping GIS-enabled software. Ellen, would you like to talk about the corridor analysis table?
Sure. I'd also just like to mention that we are, for this section, we're requesting, for what we would like you to provide input on is mostly to consider the mapping tool and the conflict map layer as you consider opportunities to revise the corridor. We're proposing a corridor change at all to make sure that we look at the conflict map and the mapping tool to provide those. The corridor analysis table is the main part of the abstract that identifies the concerns, the issues within the corridor, including jurisdictional issues, pinch points, or spacing issues within the corridor, as well as environmental and cultural resource issues. So each issue is a row in this table, and each has a milepost range attributed to it, which can be used to locate the area on the mapping tool. And then the second to last column, the source column, lists where the issue is identified, whether it was from the settlement agreement in response to the 2014 request for information or a GIS analysis. So Jeremy is going to briefly explain the agency's approach to the analysis of the issues listed in the table.
Thanks, Ellen. I'll expand on that just a little bit. That through this table, we're really trying to determine if, what the issues are, milepost by milepost, what, with relation to what resource, and if it can be resolved, if there's an opportunity to improve the corridor placement, or possibly add a IOP or a best management practice for siting something within the corridor, or if concern is not easily resolved or avoided at this corridor level planning process. We really are asking for your input in response to what the agencies have compiled in these preliminary abstracts. And as Ellen said, that these tables, the tabular portion of the abstracts, is really key to what we would like input on. Is the information accurate? Is there anything that's incorrect, or stakeholders provide any additional data, milepost locations? Anything that you can provide will help better describe the issue, or things that could be done to resolve issues is very, very helpful. Otherwise, is there missing data? Are there resources or concerns that weren't identified that we don't even have any GIS data for, that your local expertise may shed some light on? Are there potential conflicts or uses not listed in the abstract? Or are there opportunities that you see to revise the corridor that aren't already identified? To start with one example that we could walk through here in this corridor 66-212. If we scroll down, if you look on the ID along the leftmost column, they all have a comment number. We're going to scroll down to point 023. This example relates to cultural resources. If you scroll just a little bit, Jim, you can kind of see how these are bracketed out by resource. I guess we'd have to go up to the next page, perhaps. I don't quite see the header. There we go. The blue line across sort of identifies the group that these comments pertain to. So all these comments below pertain to cultural resources. So we can scroll back down to our example, point 023. So under cultural resources, we received a comment related to cultural resources, and as those cultural resources relate to the corridor. Remember that this was the first step in the public input into developing these abstracts. If you remember that process map that I showed you before. So what the BLM and Forest Service had asked Argonne to extrapolate here was to pull out identify all the historic properties listed on the National Register in the vicinity of the corridors. And in this one, you can see that we noted that in near milepost 43, there are some historic properties within the vicinity. So from there, we moved into our agency analysis framework, and there again, remember that's kind of our roadmap from that process graphic. We looked at this through the lens of foresighting principles, conflict maps, and land use plan prescriptions in this area. And as you can see in this row, although there are multiple properties, none were located within the designated corridor. So we consider this issue falling into bucket one, which means based on our analysis, we confirm that the existing corridor best meets the siting principles as it relates to the issue of cultural resources. And so for cultural resources, we believe that this corridor best meets the siting principles. And what we're really looking for from participants and stakeholders is, do you agree? Do you disagree? And why? We really want you to utilize the analysis framework to make your point. Look to those foresighting principles that we talked about. And at this level and at this time, the information that we have, this is what we've come to. Is we see this as being cited as best as it can. If you disagree, please provide us that information. Let us know why. If you see an opportunity to improve the corridor network at this location or another one, please let us know a specific. Toward the end of the presentation, we're showing you several ways to provide the agencies with your input. We've worked hard to develop some of these tools so that the purpose of this would be met to greatly enhance input into this review. And the more specific you can be, the better. Again, I say disagree with us on these. These are preliminary abstracts. We want your input. We're obviously on a time frame with everything we do, and to that end, we're asking for input by February 25th, but please get us your input. Jim, if you wouldn't mind going to the mapper and sort of showing the example that we just went through, sort of how folks can see.
All right, so I'm just cleaning up the map and taking off a couple layers that we displayed. Then, in this case, I'm just going to use the search box and type REGIS, and it'll find me the National Register of Historic Places layer. And I the map, and it displays as purple rectangles or squares on the map. And the location in question is just a little farther down the corridor here by Price. And I can zoom in a little bit and show how the corridor, or the juxtaposition of the corridor and these sites. And if you want to look up information about one of these sites, you can click on the info tool and choose one of them, and it'll give you the data for that particular site.
Thank you, Jim. Ellen, would you like to go through the other couple examples that we have for today?
Sure, and I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. But we're going to look at issue .061 next. That's under specially designated areas and its byways, which was also identified as a corridor of concern issue. And in this case, the agencies have identified a potential opportunity to reroute the corridor to avoid byways. But we're not going to go back to the mapping tool to look at this, but you can use Mapper to see where this is. It describes it in that last column between milepost 8 and milepost 111. There's a locally designated corridor west of corridor 66212 that follows existing infrastructure, which would avoid the byways. But it's important to note that although this is identified as a potential opportunity, it has not been evaluated as a potential Section 368 corridor for its impacts to other resources. So, as was mentioned earlier, we will be reviewing proposals for potential corridor revisions, deletions, or additions in the spring. But we welcome and encourage input about other potential corridor revisions at this point. And then the last example that we will give is under visual resources related to the viewshed of Arches National Park, and that's .072. And this is what we consider as a category or bucket 3 issue. It's not easily resolved at quarter level planning. The agencies acknowledge that this corridor segment has multiple concerns near the national park, and although the current route was designated because it was previously or locally designated and it has existing energy transport projects as well as a railroad and a highway, we do recognize that continued discussion and evaluation is needed for this corridor in this area. So that's sort of a category 3. This issue isn't easily resolved at corridor level planning. And I think those are the only examples we're going to give right now. Jim is going to go through how you can add input, and then we're going to open up for questions. So, Jim?
All right, thank you, Ellen. First, I'll show where the comment form is on the main website. So this would be for you to submit any comments for the information we've been discussing today, regions 2 and 3. So there's several ways to get to it. Getting involved is a good way to find that. We click that, and on the left panel, there's on several pages, this panel here, that's the input form. There's also a link here on the main page. So I'm going to click that. And here's the stakeholder input page. So I scroll down and I enter my contact information. And if I'm submitting on behalf of an organization, I click yes, I can give my organization. Otherwise, I can click no. And then I'm prompted for the geographic scope for my comment. So a review period for regions 2 and 3 is currently open. And so I'm going to click that, and then I'm going to say I'm going to comment on a specific region 2 or 3 corridor. And what that does is open up a map to help me find a corridor number if I'm not sure what it is. And I can pick a corridor off the drop-down list. So here, in one we've been working with today, I'm going to pick 6212. All right, there it is. And if I know the milepost range, I can specify it. That's optional. I can also access the abstract right here as another means of getting to that information. And I scroll down, and these categories correspond to the sections of the resource table. I can choose those that pertain to my comment and helps us categorize them. And I can enter text input, or I can attach up to 3 attachments. So if you have a formal letter or a map or some other attachment, you can do that. Finally, I click submit. When I do so, I'll get a certain number for my comment, and I can cycle back to the input form and continue submitting more comments. When I submit a comment, I will also receive an email with the substance of what I entered in this form, and the number will be part of that email, and that will be used for any subsequent communication about that comment. Important is a way that you can also use the mapping tool to make a location-specific comment. So say I wanted to talk about some of this corridor here. I click the feedback tool, and I click Start Drawing, and I can sketch on the map what areas I would like to comment on. Double-click to finish, and Start Drawing is still active, so if I wanted to add another area that's separate, I can draw another one and double-click. When I'm finished with that, I click Stop Drawing and Launch Form. Now the form, it's kept my previous information that I entered, but you might need to enter it if you haven't done that previously. And instead of that next section, I just have a snapshot of the map area that I drew. So the areas I sketched with a simple base map, and we'll use that information and we'll know exactly what area you're commenting on. I get the same information below. I can specify what areas it pertains to and give my input. And this is especially helpful to us because a lot of times we get place name descriptions and things, and they can be a little hard to decipher or time consuming. So we invite you to use this tool when you have a very specific location you want to comment on. And if it's more general, then you can use the main comment form without the mapper.
Thank you, Jim. This is Jeremy again, and I'd really like to thank everyone for participating in this process today, taking the time out of your schedule and your interest. We appreciate that very much. Your specific input will really help make this effort one that can reflect the various interests in your area, including state and local planning efforts, energy demand, local knowledge, and specific resource concerns. And we intend to give your input full consideration. This time I'd like to pass this over to Connie or Ellen to take folks off of mute, and we can go through the question and answer portion.
We do have a couple of things in the chat box, Jeremy. Heidi, if you want to ask a couple of questions.
You are no longer muted.
Box.
Yes, I'll do that. So let me just run through where we are. So we have one that, the first one is from Sally Edwards. It says, did each set of county commissioners participate in the early planning in 2012? And do they continue to be engaged? And did Connie or Jeremy want to answer that?
I can't answer the specific portion of the question related to the early planning in 2012. I wasn't involved in this effort at that time. But I certainly hope that they are continue to be engaged. Our intent is to reach out to all state and local governments throughout this process, and yet there's always challenges in doing that. So I can assure you that our best efforts are being made to be in contact with all stakeholders at county commissioners level as well as state level. All stakeholders means all stakeholders to us, but that's a tall order sometimes. So that's kind of how I would answer that at this point.
And the next question that we have, well, this is a comment. Actually, corridors should be located to minimize impact on private landowners and ensure that transmission lines are located on federal lands to the greatest extent possible. So thank you, Mike, for that comment. And also, Mike Hyde noted a coal plant area that was shown has been demolished. And I'll let Connie add to this, but I think those are great comments for us to work through to see if we have any updates to be made on our GIS.
Yeah, and Heidi, I think if he's referring to the Helper plant, if Mark and Jim can go to the Corridor 66-212 abstract just on the front page, or the start of the table, I think it mentioned that we understood that that was no longer in service. It probably was referring.
I would just like to mention that, Mike, that is an excellent comment, and that's exactly the input that we would like. You know, the previous comment as well. That is the input that we're absolutely looking for. The more specific, the better. So in that case, I would encourage folks, if they had a comment similar to that, that they would use the mapper and click on that feedback button, draw a little box in that area, and provide that information. That's an excellent comment, Mike. Thank you.
And so the next comment from Pam Murray regarding providing how to provide comments, I think Jim already answered in the demonstration. And so now from Brett Smithers, we have the question, do we know how many of these corridors are already have existing infrastructure, both for transmission lines and buried pipelines? And I presume that Brett found that layer in the mapper tool. but maybe Jim can just, I think he's just demonstrating where in the layers it is now on the left side of the mapper tool. So in case you didn't see that before, those layers are all present. And yes.
This is a good question. I'd just like to chime in for just a second, Heidi. Appreciate the question, Brett, and glad that you were able to find that there are a lot of layers. There's a lot of information there. We try to make that available, but there is sometimes difficulties with sifting through it. If there is a specific or specific bit of information that you're looking for, I want to encourage you also, if you're having any difficulties throughout the process, please email us at corridors@anl.gov, and you'll get a follow-up message from this webinar with that email address.
So the next question here is from Eleanor Bravo. Is this being recorded, and can we send a link? And yes, I'm sorry if we didn't mention at the beginning, but this webinar is being recorded, and I believe the link will be available through the project website, I would say within a week, probably. Does that sound right, Connie?
We're going to get things out as quickly as we can, so that you can have people who weren't able to join the webinar today can ask questions. And I also wanted to, I have one person who's asked a question in the chat box, but also has raised their hand. Dara Parker, do you want to hit star and ask your question?
Sure, thank you so much. I apologize if you already addressed this, but could you share a little bit more about how the final report will be included in the resource management planning process? I think there's some confusion down in my area about whether land use amendments will be considered and pursued, or whether the information will just be incorporated into future planning processes, every 15 to 20 or so years.
Yeah, I can answer that. It's a great question, and what I would say to that is some of that will depend somewhat on local management discretion as to whether or not they take initiative to, I guess, begin a land use plan amendment specific to this process. It certainly is possible to be able to do it that way, and it's also possible that they would just carry it forward into their next normal land use planning process. It's really kind of a case-by-case matter. We are discussing internally the possibility of developing some policy related to how the information should be carried forward, and we're certainly looking at all options as far as that goes. So certainly if there's interest in that or comments related to that too, that would be very good information for us to have as well. Does that answer substantial enough, or me?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think depending on the comments and the recommendations would also drive whether an amendment would be, helpful. I was just, I think looking at a quarter by quarter or case by case, perspective makes a lot of sense. I wasn't sure if there were kind of individual positions on that based on the agency involved, so that the BLM is going to handle the information in one way, the Forest Service might handle it in another way, knowing that it's, location by location or RMP is very helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. I wanted to briefly just answer a couple of other questions I see on the chat box here. Where will the workshops be held? Well, we are planning on having a workshop in each of the 5 states I mentioned at the beginning. We plan to have that information fine-tuned here, fairly soon, but we don't have it nailed down just yet. We're trying to make it in probably the most geographically relevant area. And so with that, if there's any sort of input that folks want to provide related to that, we would definitely take that into consideration as well. When does the comment period close? This comment period right now for the related to the preliminary abstract, the 45-day input comment period closes on February 25th. So we have just a little bit over 30 days left. Is there an online way to submit comments? I think we covered that. Next question here is, are the GIS files associated with the mapper the same as when Region 1 was being publicly analyzed? Connie or Jim, would you mind fielding that? Maybe you could speak to the GIS layers and the updates since Region 1.
Sure. They are slightly different. One of the important things is the Surface Management Agency jurisdictions have changed in some locations. If the jurisdiction is no longer BLM or Forest Service under one of those originally designated corridors, that area has been removed. But we are subject to the level of accuracy that we have in the current layer, so there's some possibility that there's an issue there. There were other minor corrections. In 2 locations, the description in the record of decision didn't exactly match the GIS data, and so we corrected the GIS data to match what was described. Almost every change has been reduction of the corridor area, and there's only very slight areas that were added in, I think, 2 cases. If you email corridors@anl.gov, I can give you a very much more detailed answer to that.
There's also been some data layers that have been added since the Region 1 as the data become available.
A question here from Ed to LaRue. What is the time frame for the same discussion pertaining to Region 1? With the Region 1 review, we have kind of moved beyond this phase of the scoping and the public comment period related to the abstracts. Like I mentioned previously, we do plan to have the draft report, which we'll be taking public input on as well. We hope to have that out in March. So thank you, Jim, for pulling up the roadmap to our process. So with Region 1, we're through the blue portion and the abstracts have been finalized. We've also moved through Step 2, which is in-person workshops. So really we're in Step 3, and we're finalizing the draft report right now. We need to get that buttoned up, and then we plan to have that out and released to the public in general sometime in March. So look forward to that. A question here about, given the enormous amount of data and review required, is it possible to extend the deadline for public comment? Well, that's always an option. We can certainly consider that, Kathy. So I guess send us an email maybe to that effect related to maybe something specific. But like I said, we do have a time frame, so we're trying to balance the need for review and but also try to get this thing done in a timely fashion. So definitely we'll give that consideration. Next question here is from Lynn. Is an example of an IOP something like transmission lines must be underground? There's a Phoenix USD conflict, for example. And that's a great question. We could give you a link on the website. We have if you could email us, we can give you a link to the entire catalog of interagency operating procedures, which we look at as best management practices related to siting and corridors. So that, I think, would be if you don't mind emailing, that would be a wonderful way for us to get information to you. Otherwise, I might be able to find you and just email you that information. A couple other questions Lindsay has within the Section 368 stakeholder input, your topics, land management responsibilities, environmental resource issues. Can a box be added for wildlife resources, or if we are providing a comment towards wildlife impacts, would that be the appropriate box to check? Or what would be the appropriate box to check? Jim, could you speak to that, perhaps?
This is Ellen White. I can speak to that. That would just be under ecology. All of wildlife would be under ecology, and that lumps together special status species and wildlife.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Yeah, I want to reassure folks in general, these comment here and question, regardless of kind of what category you put stuff into, we're obviously going to give these comments and input and potential revisions full consideration. So we're obviously going to read them all, and we will get them to where they need to go if you don't hit the exact right checkbox. So want to allay those fears out there a little bit. Good comment from Garrett. See you in Las Vegas. Kathy, the website says the comment period ends February 24th. I think the initial we were looking at February 24th, and apologize if that's incorrect. We figured that since the 25th carries us through the weekend, we would just go with that. And since we were a little bit delayed with getting the abstract posted, we felt like we'd give just a little bit extra time there. So February 25th is really the deadline. So end of date, February 25th is kind of what we're looking at. We have a request here to hold a workshop in Albuquerque. Thank you, Eleanor. Definitely look at that. Comment about the webinar. Thank you. Okay, please reiterate how long before an account is approved. Been waiting for a second email.
That one's for me. I'm starting to process them right now. There were 34 during the webinar, so and I was doing the presentation. So normally it would be pretty prompt during the workday.
Thank you, Jim. Gunnison Sageground. Thank you, Lynn. Well, with that, I really appreciate folks taking the time to participate and get involved in this process. Give just a minute here if there's any other questions or comments related to today's presentation or the process in general. Otherwise, I'd like to just thank you all for participating today, and please give us your input. We really look to you to make this as comprehensive as a review as possible. So with that, I wish you a good day and goodbye.